You can hear an exclusive in-depth interview with me, Alex Belfield, and Noel Edmonds at www.celebrityradio.biz, where last year we had over 8.7 million minutes viewed. That's a 40-minute exclusive interview recorded at the end of July 2015. In this segment, we talk about the media, commercial radio, the BBC and its future. And we began by talking about a catastrophic 6 week for the BBC.
I mean, I love the BBC, and I don't want to see it collapse and fail. But it is difficult to see with its current strategy how that can be avoided. It only requires 6% of licence payers to stop paying, and the whole lot collapses. You know, this is an organisation with a guaranteed, £4.5 billion income. Well, a lot of private companies would like to have a guaranteed income of that. They spend £120 million collecting the licence fee.
Yes.
So, you know, I mean, it's just absolutely insane. There's nearly 1 million licence payers who pay just simply to collect the licence. They don't get anything for it. And you have to ask the question whether the second letter in the title BBC is actually achievable, because there is a very strong argument that broadcasting is on its way out, that you can no longer spray and pray, that niche casting, genre casting, is the way forward, because the consumer is now in charge. You know, forget people living in Notting Hill and wandering into the BBC on very nice salaries. You know, they're not in charge. The consumer's in charge, and hooray for that.
Yeah, 770 BBC people have taken redundancy and are now working for the corporation again full-time, which cost us $33 million. That level of corruption has to stop. This is public money, and we haven't got it to waste, have we?
Yeah, be careful with the word corruption. I don't believe the BBC is a corrupt organisation for one moment. I think there are elements of it that are truly incompetent.
And you mentioned Chris Evans. It's interesting as well with him. I mean, he's the first biggest star to do as many jobs as you did when you were there. Do you see the parallels between you and him? Do you think he's as good as you were?
Well, I can't answer that last part of that question. You know, I'm confident but not arrogant. It's interesting. I sat at the Monaco Grand Prix. I was a guest on Chris's boat briefly to do a Q&A with these with the people that paid a huge amount of money to children in need to go for the weekend. I mean, Chris has raised huge amounts of money doing that. And after the Q&A, he and I sat and had a little chat. And we talked about Top Gear and whatever. And Chris said, no, I wouldn't touch it with a barge pole. And he said how tired he was. And he did look very tired. And so I was absolutely stunned when, within weeks, I read, you know, that he'd not only shown interest, that he'd accepted the job. I just hope he's not taking on too much. He is a brilliant talent. He is also a mercurial talent in the true Kenny Everett, Clarkson mould. And he will need to be managed and supported. Otherwise, he could just burn out and make some shocking mistakes. I hope it works out for him. I'm a big fan of his.
I was excited to read that Moyles might be coming back to breakfast radio. He's another one in your league, in Evans's league, who's sort of become a megastar of breakfast radio. Do you think that could reinvent FM broadcasting, or is it too late? It all seems to be going online. That seems to be the way the BBC agree with iPlayer, that's the future, not terrestrial broadcasting.
I cannot see how traditional broadcasting can survive in any sort of influential way. All of the commercial stations in the UK are struggling. They are finding it very, very difficult to get their ad revenues. Newspapers are finding it difficult with ad revenues. People like DM and GT, the Daily Mail and Mail Online and whatever, they've reinvented themselves online. It's very difficult to see how an FM station, any of our local radio stations, can reinvent themselves. The consumer doesn't want it. The consumer does not want to tolerate for a second stuff that they're not interested in. And too much of radio isn't relevant to them.
Is BBC local radio worth £112 million a year?
No, it isn't. Of course it isn't. And the Gaelic services aren't worth it either. If you want to have Gaelic broadcasting, you can get that online and you can get it done better. It's insane that they spend something like £40-50 million a year entertaining tens of thousands of people.
Yeah.
It's insane that they fund the BBC World Service. You know, do people living in the UK really want to be funding government propaganda? The whole structure of it. So you've gone back to the Beeb again, but the whole structure of it is wrong, which is why last year I revealed that I had a consortium lined up, and we are ready to buy the BBC. It requires an Act of Parliament, but we would buy the BBC and save the BBC.
It's interesting, when you came out with that, people laughed at it and thought it was a joke, but it seems like, again, in recent weeks, it is not unthinkable that it could happen, because the BBC as we know it is not going to be around in 5 years. They're going to certainly cut the budget to a point where there can't be these thousands of journalists up and down the country, and there's a good argument that there shouldn't be that many. What would you do then? What would your BBC look like, and how many people would it employ?
Well, just on the first part of that, I was interviewed on Newsnight, and Jeremy Paxman sneered at me when I said I had this consortium and we would buy the BBC. Within weeks, he had left Newsnight, and within weeks, he had attacked the BBC publicly in a number of articles. You know, there's a lot of two-faced people, and I'm not being two-faced about it. I had 30 great years at the BBC. I've made my position clear. I would hate to see the UK lose the BBC, but it has to be pared down and fit for purpose. It's trying to be all things to all people in an age when Apple could crush it tomorrow.
So what would you do then? Back to my original question.
You have to pare it down. You have to accept the fact that the consumer is king, and therefore people can get their local news and information from other sources. You don't need that massive news operation. Gone are the days where the BBC led the world in impartial news. It's struggling to defend itself as being impartial, and clearly from the recent election coverage, it's not impartial. Yeah. So when in the world of CNN and Al Jazeera, big global broadcasters, and obviously the power of the internet, you know, BBC News no longer carries the respect it used to. So you've got to cut down the whole of the news side of it. You've got to focus on probably a couple of good TV channels, and you've got to really focus upon original programming. People want good content. They don't want repeats of shows. They don't want padding things out. And you think ITV threw themselves into a multi-channel environment and immediately lost millions, and because they're private, had to close them all down.
Yeah.
Well, the BBC staggers on with channels that at times only hundreds of people patronise.
And there's a good argument that Radio 1 and 2 should be closed, as we heard last week, but they're hugely popular. Would you defend those, or have they got to go too?
Probably you need two very good radio channels, and how you configure them, I don't particularly want to reveal, but do you remember there used to be two? One was called the Light Programme, and one was called the Home Service.
Yeah.
Radio 3, forget it. You know, it's too elitist, and it's too irrelevant. Classic FM do a good job, and now I've launched Positively Royal. We play excellent classical music. So, no, that's got to go. I think a BBC where it focuses upon what it used to do best, which was encouraging talent and producing original content on a small number of channels, and clearly an internet presence. They've got to, they can't walk away from the internet, and it's got to be funded in a slightly different way. But it's all going to fall apart if it just staggers on the way it is.
And finally, on the BBC, getting turkeys to vote for Christmas. How do we get rid of managers to get rid of managers?
Yeah, that's a problem, isn't it? That's always been a problem. But when I own it with my really good team, it won't be a problem, Alex.
You can sort that out. And very finally, aside from the BBC, although it's related, I did the last interview with Jimmy Savile. At this point, when you look back, is it astonishing, again, A, how the BBC handled it, and the B, that it was kept so quiet for so long?
I don't know. It's a really good question. And there's an assumption that because I was at Radio 1 when Savile was there, and I also hosted Top of the Pops, and I was on BBC television and whatever, that I would know anything about that. And it sort of almost seems a bit naive to say, but I didn't know about it. I mean, I read an interview recently with Anne Nightingale, and Anne was asked that question. She said, you know what, I used to go to the BBC, do my job and go home. And that's what I've always said. You know, it was an incredibly competitive environment. I didn't have friends amongst my colleagues. I was only ever on a 13-week contract at Radio 1. You never knew who was going to get your show or stab you in the back or whatever. So I just tried to be very, very professional. And I was astonished. I just thought, actually, Jimmy Savile wasn't very good. I thought he was weird. When I met him, I thought he was odd. And I thought he was a crap broadcaster.
You make it look so easy, and that, of course, is the joy of Noel Edmonds, and the fact that you're positively happy. This is the brand new set of radio stations, really 400 of them. How are we going to find these, and who's going to manage them, and who's going to be on them?
This venture is the biggest thing that I have ever done, and I look around and I think to myself, I wonder why nobody thought of doing it. And the best way to describe it is that 100 years ago, the first magazines appeared dedicated to individual subjects, activities, leisure pursuits, and whatever. And over that century, the magazine shelves gradually got heavier and heavier with all sorts. There was a magazine for everything. Then Sky came along, and they introduced us to the electronic program guide, and we got used to the fact there were multiple channels, and that those channels were actually dedicated to individual subjects. But nobody in radio has ever produced genre-specific radio stations. And that's what I launched last year, very quietly, and is what I've been building. And we have 7 categories. We have radio stations for countries, cities, for interests, for leisure pursuits, for health and well-being. And you can literally build the soundtrack to your lifestyle by dipping in and out of my radio stations. They're all the same in that they have no news, because news is negative and very bad for your health. They have no commercials, and they are totally free. They're all different because each covers a different subject.
And I guess it's infinite. I mean, you could have Chess FM, you could have Computers FM, you can have, obviously, music from 20s, 30s, 40s.
The link is positivity, because, as I say, we don't have, this is ironic, but bearing in mind where I started, but we don't have prattling DJs. We are news-free, commercial-free, and totally free to the consumer. And we have subjects ranging from positively voting, positively, yes, you could do chess if you wanted. I hadn't thought of that. Not very good on the radio, but never mind. But we've got one of our most successful stations, in all seriousness, now listened to in over 80 countries. At any one time in the UK, 20 million people are suffering from insomnia. And Positively Sleepy plays binaural tones, which is part of brain entrainment. And honestly, you listen for 5 minutes and you're off to sleep. It is brilliant. We've got another one that energizes you, Positively Vibe. We launched Positively Royal recently. I managed to get Radio 4, the voice of Radio 4, Brian Perkins, out of retirement, and he's the host on the station. So positivity is the theme, the thread. They're all called Positively something. And yet every single one is genre-specific, supported by social media.
Noel, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. You're such a legend.
Thank you, Alex.
And you deserve every success. Positivelyhappy.com is a place to go and hear just great music. It's really uplifting. And as you say, there's no nonsense in between. You just get on with it. Noel Edmonds' new book is going to be out later in the year. And hopefully we'll see you for a new series next year with Deal or No Deal. And of course, the series continues on Channel 4. Thanks so much for your time.
Alex, thank you very much for your time.